All right, here we are. Chapter 5. They take up the sword. And the first section is the great open spaces. So, last time we talked about how the material things that they had, such as iron, glass, silk, and also the animals that they had, all were consistent with a Central Asian origin and skills. I really loved and appreciated the points and arguments that Hugh Nibley had about, civilization does not sit there and advance slowly and surely. In an archaeological time frame, it happens suddenly, and it stays in that civilization until it either rejects the technology, finds something better and rejects it, or it regresses because it's just not stable enough to keep up that kind of trade. So it's not this smooth, slow percolation of technology and information. So now he continues on with his letter/book about taking up the sword in the great open spaces. So let's go with that. All right. My dear Professor F., if my insistent harping on Central Asia annoys you, let me remind you again that the Book of Ether gives us no choice. It never lets us forget that what the Jaredite kings did was a conscientious imitation and unbroken continuation of the ways of the ancients, of them of old, on the other side of the water. This, incidentally, is another indication that we are not to regard the Jaredite migration as taking place immediately after the flood, for the fall of the tower saw the destruction of an ancient and established order. The Jaredites left their homeland driving great herds of cattle before them in the immemorial Asiatic manner, and even if they had never been nomads before, they certainly lived the life of the steppes during those many years before they set sail in Ether 3.3. And when they embarked, they crammed all they could of their beasts onto their small boats, flocks and herds, and other beasts in Ether 6.4, and upon reaching the New World, continued to cultivate all manner of cattle, of oxen, of cows, and of sheep, just as their ancestors had in the old country. That's Ether 9.18. Nothing could be better calculated to keep the old world ways alive than those notoriously conservative secret societies which Ether always traces back to the oaths of the ancients. In this way, he's not talking about conservative versus liberal of political ideology. He's talking about conservative as in they have conserved or preserved the ideas of the old ways, and which at all times have exerted a fatal attraction on the men of Asia. We have already, so the oaths, the taking of money, and more. There's apparently even older stuff that makes assassinations of kings on the table, which, yeah, we're talking the antediluvian stuff. We have already noted that such secret abominations are the necessary product of a society in which social ties may be easily broken. The political history of the Jaredites clearly betrays in all its aspects the ways of the space people. I don't think he was talking about little green men space people, but the ways of having large spaces people. Remember, this was 1953, just before the whole alien thing in the 60s. Never mind, I'm just joking. When did the whole Roswell and alien craze happen? Was it 50s? It may have been. Yeah, okay, end of the 1940s. Yeah, no, they would have had that. Anyways, but I still don't think he's talking about little green men. Jaredite history in the New World was formally inaugurated by a General Assembly and census of the entire nation, see Ether 619, and a thoroughly Asiatic practice, which goes back to the days of prehistoric hunters and which lies at the root of all ancient political organization, as I have demonstrated in a number of articles. Strictly in accordance with the ancient pattern, this assembly was the occasion for the choosing of a king and the establishment of a dynasty, which, as the brother of Jared clearly foresaw, could only lead straight to the slough of old world intrigue and turmoil from which the Jaredites had already been once delivered. See Ether 623. He was right, for presently one Korihor rebelled against his father and went over and dwelt in the land of Nahor and drew away many people after him. Ether 7:4. Then he went back to the land of Moron and captured his father, but was subdued by his righteous brother Shul, who achieved an ambition of every Asiatic monarch to spread his kingdom upon all the face of the land. That's Ether 7:11. Shul then gave his capable brother an erstwhile rival power in his kingdom. That's Ether 7:13. A surprising but quite authentic touch from which it appears that emirs shared in the immense task of ruling the empire in Asia. Shul's grandson rebelled against his father and came and dwelt in the land of Heth, drawing away people until he had gained half the kingdom. Ether 8:2. He deposed his father. His deposed father, departed out of the land with his family and traveled many days to reach the place where later the Nephites were to be destroyed. From there he continued eastward until he reached the sea. 9:3, where he lived in tents and was joined in time by other refugees from his distracted kingdom. 9:9, where civil war had reduced the population almost to zero. Another Asiatic touch, as we shall see, years later, when the royal brothers Jared and Coriantumr fought for the kingdom, the latter beat his brother, did pursue him in the wilderness of Achish, where the two armies raided each other by night and did lay siege to the wilderness until Coriantumr emerged the victor, chased his brother's successor to the seashore, only to be beaten in turn and pursued back into the wilderness of Achish, taking all the people with him as he fled before Lib. See Ether 14:15. More battles and other pursuits to the coast, 14:26. Thence to the waters of Ripliancum, then southward to camp in Ogath, thence to the hill Ramah for the showdown. This sampling should give you a picture of the peculiar warfare of the Jaredites, a war of motion with no set frontiers, great armies sweeping over the continent in flight or pursuit, making the most of space by continually falling back on this or that wilderness, setting up rival camps for a period of a year or two, while dissenting groups or individuals join themselves to one army or another. It is Asia all over again, and it calls for a geographical note. The North American continent is a rough copy of the Asiatic, with tundra and forest in the north giving way to open grasslands, deserts, and finally tropical jungles in the south. The main difference is that in Asia, everything is bigger. The forests and plains seem never-ending. The deserts are wider, hotter, and drier. The mountains far higher and more forbidding. The jungles deeper and more dangerous. The rivers wider and deeper. Yet these formidable barriers have not prevented the rapid and ceaseless marches and countermarches of mighty armies in every age. One of the earliest Aryan texts is the prayer, "May we go smoothly along the roads, find good pathways in the mountains, run easily through the forests, and cross happily the rivers." During one campaign, we are told the army of Juji was separated by only about 1,200 miles. Only. From the main body of the Mongols. That should give some idea of the distances covered by these hordes that would winter in the plains of France or Hungary and make their summer camps in the Altai or on the Onon River, almost within sight of the North Pacific. It was not all flat plains either, for the kings of the steppes extended their rule time and again to China, India, Persia, Asia Minor, Europe, and Siberia, which meant regularly traversing the greatest deserts, highest mountains, and widest rivers on earth. The Asiatic state consists of two main elements. On the one hand, a sedentary populace living in oasis cities and bringing the arts, industry, and agriculture to sometimes astonishing peaks of perfection. And on the other hand, a migratory ruler moving at the head of his warlike host, a tribal army of conquerors, with his own tribe and family as its nucleus, ever marching from city to city and from castle to castle, over burning wastes or freezing mountains passes, to overawe the world, stifle rebellion, and above all curtail the ambitions of any possible rival to world dominion. This army is a moving nation with its wives and children. The Mongols, when they left their families behind, inaugurated a radical change in steppe warfare, achieving a speed and mobility that quickly paralyzed the slower-moving hordes of their rivals, who still observed the old-fashioned custom of marching with their families and household effects. The Hyksos in the 18th century BC and the people of the sea, 500 years later, were just such nations on the march, a devastating army, but an army carrying all their goods and families along with them as they sought new lands to settle, sweeping off the inhabitants of the land, all who would not join them, exactly in the Jaredite manner. See Ether 1527. Sorry, gotta extend my back here. At all times among the people of the steppes, the nation and the army are one and the same. The lord of the clan or rex becoming duke or voivode in battle. I'm just looking at, okay, all the footnotes are just references to really cool books, no information in the footnotes. This is certainly the case with the Jaredites, whose kings are, before everything, leaders in the field, and who go to battle with their wives and their children, both men, women, and children being armed with weapons of war, having shields and breastplates, and being clothed after the manner of war. Ether 1515. The armor deserves mention, since it is now known that armor is another Central Asiatic invention of great antiquity, borrowed in later times by Europe and the Far East, but reaching a high state of perfection on the steppes in prehistoric times. He gets that from E.A. Spicer, Journal M. or Sock. Hungarian words for armor indicate Central Asian origin. So, interesting. Since the Jaredite kings, with their migratory armies, were constantly on the move in the best Asiatic manner, is there any reason why they should not have... Is there any reason why they should not have covered Asiatic distances? Then why all the fuss about Cumorah? From the narrow neck of land to New York State is a distance that staggers us, but for Juji or Timur it would be like a milk run. For Juji or Timur it would be a milk run, because we think of journeys in terms of hours or days at most. We are liable to forget that people who never stop moving think of space not in terms of time, but of stages. Okay, so, this is interesting, because this is betraying the idea of what, I guess not betraying, but it's revealing the concept Hugh Nibley has of the distances. So he's thinking of kind of an entire continental version of the land for the Book of Mormon, where it is vast distances, and there's no problem with that, because why not? You just go up to Cumorah in New York, going from the narrow neck of land, which I assume he's talking about the narrow neck of land between North and South America, up to New York, for him is like, so what? For him, it's a milk run. Now, that's an assumption. He hasn't ever specifically mentioned in this book that he's thinking that the narrow neck of land is like near Panama. For all we know, he could also be thinking of the Yucatan Peninsula, because it's at least narrower on the north end and the south end of that peninsula. That's interesting. That is interesting. I wonder. Well, hopefully I'll get the replay, because it's gonna be hilarious if. Anyways, I think what the reason why we think of it's either going to be in Mesoamerica or it's going to be in the heartland of America is because later in the Book of Mormon, well, not later in the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon before Ether, because Ether is really ancient compared to when Nephi and Lehi are, they give how many days it takes them to get from one area to another. And which makes me wonder, there's like very few mentions of horses in the Book of Mormon, because they love to bring that up as an anachronism. One of them has to do with Ammon serving King Lamoni and making his chariots ready. So it makes me wonder, what in the world, because there's so little mention of animals, horses, they very well could have been very rare. It's just like, they may have, there's all sorts of things that are very uncertain, only because of the lack of mention in the Book of Mormon, and also time frames and time scales. Like, the idea of him going from a narrow neck of land, maybe down south, maybe Yucatan Peninsula, maybe Panama, for whatever Hugh Nibley is arguing, up to Cumorah in New York, for him he's like, that's no big deal for the Jaredites, and that's very true. But I would think that would be if you have some sort of oxen or some sort of horse or other thing. Now, they talk about, having these herds brought with them. And it could be that they were kept basically domesticated most of the time or the whole time, or that they wouldn't survive on their own. And like, for example, if humans were to disappear overnight, just gone, what animals would truly survive, right? Think about it. How many dog breeds would immediately die off just because they are like incapable of surviving? But how many other dog breeds would survive? How many cats would survive? How many wouldn't? How many animals are being sustained by humans currently, whether in zoos or other captivity? I doubt the pandas would make it, for example. And a lot of other animals that are literally being sustained by us just because they ain't gonna make it in the natural world anymore. They've become way too dependent on us. And so is the same with a lot of domesticated animals. What about cows, right? Now, we'd think, well, cows should do fine. I mean, they're out in the field all the time anyways. I don't know, right? We have domesticated cows in such a way that bulls are often very aggressive. It might really change the landscape. Maybe they don't make it. Maybe they've become so domesticated that it's like with how farmers artificially inseminate cows so that the bull doesn't rip them to shreds because they've been bred to be so beefy and so aggressive. On the other hand, there are other ones that may do that all naturally. I'm not a farmer, unfortunately. I don't have cows that I take care of, so I don't know how dependent they are on us. But at the same time, what would happen to them if they didn't have them being fed by us? How many would eventually die? Or how many would run free? I don't know. And so I sit here and think, when you have these giant wars where you're likely using everything that you can to help destroy your enemy, as is what happens at the end of Ether, a lot of your herds and flocks are going to be destroyed in sustaining your army and even just fighting each other. And then after everyone is basically dead and no one is taking care of these animals, and they're left in a state of disrepair, and they're dependent on the humans or civilization that had kept them as domesticated animals, they could easily die out. Anyway, sorry, that's all what came to mind. Well, I'm thinking of, for him, he's just saying nonchalantly, they could go from the narrow neck of land, which I'm assuming he's talking about Panama, up to New York. I'm like, wouldn't that facilitate the necessity of having a type of animal you could ride? Because that's what the people in the steppes had. They had, again, I'm not a great historian, but if I remember right, the stirrup, being able to ride horses with stirrups so you could shoot on horseback, was a huge advantage. But having the horse that you could, horse or animal, you could ride into battle, that could also pull your stuff, was a big advantage, and would make going those distances not a big deal, as he's saying. But let's continue on with what he has to say. Because we think of journeys in terms of hours or days at the most, we are liable to forget that the people who never stop moving think of space not in terms of time, but of stages, and that when it is broken down into stages, the longest route on Earth becomes negotiable, even to the most primitive means of transportation. In a word, distance is no object. A glance at the map will show that the vast extent of territory covered by the Jaredites is really rather moderate by Asiatic standards. The Brigham Young Academy expedition of 1900 went from Provo to Panama in a remarkably short time, though poorly equipped by any standards. See Appendix 2. Is there an appendix in here? Let's see. Hey, there is. We'll get those. Those are actually pretty short. They're much smaller print, but they're just like a page or two each for the appendixes. We'll just read straight through to the end of the book. So keep that in mind. So he is thinking on a continental scale. So that means he would think of the north part of South America as the land of Nephi, the narrow neck of land, and the land northward as the land of desolation? I think, again, later on that gets reined in by the descriptions in the Book of Mormon where it talks about they went so many days' journey, but again, they don't mention, we always assume that they're traveling by foot, only because they don't mention the way that they move. How far could you travel if you had something to take the weight and ride with? We're used to the pioneers and how long it took because they had oxen and wagons and they were walking and trudging across the plains. And that took them months. It basically took them a half a year to go from the jumping off point, which would have been, well, Nauvoo, Council Bluffs, Iowa, and Council Bluffs and Winter Quarters on the other side of the river. So from there, following the Platte River and other things like that, they probably would have joined up with that. Following basically the Oregon Trail until they did the split off into Utah so that they'd be left alone. So, but that took them months. But I don't know, I'm just wondering. I wonder if it would have been a lot I wonder if wagon trains with oxen were faster. And if so, what if you had wagon trains that had horses instead? Because obviously anyway, sorry, I'm just going through all this in my head, and I'm trying to figure out how Hugh Nibley is thinking versus how I think, and see the differences, and try and figure out, well, does he have a good argument? Or is it really that it was only a few few days' journey, which means if it was by foot, it would be a much smaller region. But what if it's not by foot and we just don't know what they did for transportation? Wow, cool. Many things to think about. All right. Appendix 2. All right. When King Omer was overthrown by his son Jared and had to travel many days before he was beyond the reach of the usurper who had seized a kingdom that was spread upon all the face of the land, Ether 9:3 and also 7:11. In fact, he fled as far as he possibly could from Central America to the Great Lakes and New England coast regions. So this is literally how he's thinking. From Central America, so he is thinking down near Panama, to the Great Lakes and New England coast regions, which were to become the classic hiding and fighting grounds of the latest Jaredites. It is here that we must seek the bones and burial mounds of the Jaredites, but not their cities. Just as the great structures of the Mongols, among the noblest buildings on earth, are to be found in the south and west, far from the primordial hunting and fighting grounds of the tribes, so the great monuments of Jaredite civilization abound in one wilderness of the last great. So the great monuments of Jaredite civilization abound in the wilderness of the last great battles. One of the strange paradoxes of history is that the nomads of the steppes were perhaps the greatest city builders of all times, though their normal type of city was more suggestive of an ordo-like tent city than a town in the usual sense. In the land, see, dude, he's got a lot of really cool arguments and ideas. And it is quite expansive, his vision and ideas. That's interesting. Maybe I should sit there and, There's a lot to reconsider about how fast can you move if you're on horseback and purposefully traveling. Maybe it is that the Nephites didn't have horses while the Jaredites did. Like I said, if they had become so dependent, maybe they died off. I don't know. I don't. That is one of those things that it's just like, I don't know enough history or archaeology of all these different regions to, but at least he's making good arguments for the range of what they're talking about here. And his ideas, I get it. But it's one of those things where it's like, well, I'll file it away and compare it to what things I will find later on to figure out if it's viable. So this is kind of cool, though. Let's keep going. Wow, this is way, way cool. From Central America to the Great Lakes, to the New England coast regions, last great battles, tent cities. In the lands of the Mongol conquerors, he builds Taj Mahals and Jehols, but I don't know Jehols. But in his own lands, the winds clean up the place where he has been, which has been soiled. The pastures which his flocks have cropped grow greener than ever, and nature promptly repairs all the mischief he has done to her clean orderliness. And so mighty nomad empires rose and vanished into the unknown without a trace. The thing to note is that the Asiatic pattern of camp culture that leaves no mark behind and city culture have been characteristically sponsored by the same tribes and rulers since the beginning of history. That people should live as nomads yet build great cities is no more contradictory than that they should be both hunters and farmers, or both herdsmen and merchants at one and the same time. But from the first, men have preferred to practice hunting, grazing, and farming in special areas set aside for the purpose, a custom duly observed by the Jaredites, as we have seen. So that's either 10, 19 through 21. So basically it's saying that there's areas that are like, hey, this is for grazing and farming. And, just have these entire regions for this thing, and that's it. A study of the old Asiatic system will prove a ready explanation for any apparent difficulties in locating Cumorah, where the Book of Mormon says it was. The normal life in Asia is one of chaos, violence, and insecurity, produced by constant warring between the tribes and rivalry among ambitious men within them. From time to time, a superman appears who, first gaining complete control of one tribe, ruthlessly crushes his neighbors one by one, forcing the survivors to make common cause against him and form a great coalition. A final showdown in which this coalition is either destroyed or victorious in a great battle of the nations decides the fate of the world for generations to come. If the great man wins, the world knows a period of enforced peace and unity under the absolute sway of one iron will. At any moment in his career, the world conqueror has to face one particular rival, and his most dangerous rival of the hour, against whom his whole attention is directed, with passionate personal hatred and dedicated fury. This can be shown from almost any page of the life of any would-be cosmocrat, from Sargon to Hitler. It is the leitmotif of, that's a vocabulary word, leitmotif? I would say kind of like motif, according to its usage, but let's take a look here. Come on, please do as I ask. Leitmotif. L-E-I-T M motif. Leitmotif? Ha! It's actually leitmotif. I was reading it wrong. That's why. I would say motif, but it is leitmotif. It is the leitmotif of the Jaredite history as well, which, whenever it becomes coherent, crystallizes about the person of some dreadful but competent warrior pitted against an equally alarming rival. While Coriantumr dwelt with his army in the wilderness for the space of 2 years, in which he did receive strength to his army, his opponent Shared also received strength to his army. Through the operation of secret combination, later Coriantumr pitched his tents by the hill Ramah and spent 4 years gathering together his people. That's 1511-14. Just so Genghis Khan hid out in the wilderness for 2 years, recruiting an army against his relative Wang Khan, who was doing the same thing, and later devoted 4 years to building up an army to meet the emperor of Khwarizm, who worked feverishly to build up his army, each donning everything in his power to draw off his enemy's supporters to his side. This system of drawing off is, as we've noticed before, very ancient in Asia. There is even a special Arabic word for it, jadhab. From whom shall I take away the awful sovereignty? Asks Mithra in the Avesta, which is full of legendary heroes who draw off each other's followers. Whew. This is a totally different way of warfare. This is so foreign to me. It's really interesting. The gathering of rival forces is regularly accompanied, as the Book of Mormon, by exchange of personal letters is between the chiefs and sending of formal challenges. Let Shan Yu come to the south and either meet the emperor in open battle, or else become a subject and pay reverence to the imperial throne, is a typical example. Jealousy and ambition, says Xenophon, are the essence of Asiatic kingship, which is an intensely personal thing. He describes how Croesus and Cyrus each devoted every ounce of energy and treasure gathering to gather huge conglomerate armies to fight it out for rule of all Asia. How intensely personal this rivalry was has been recounted in the unforgettable pages of Herodotus. In the Egyptian annals, Pharaoh alone is the only victor and the only hero. And the issue of every war is simply his personal argument with the opposing monarch. Yeah, it's true. They kind of focus on that, don't they? Every king of Babylonia or Assyria performs all his tremendous feats single-handed. Whoop. Sorry, the book closed on me. Here we are. Every king of Babylonia or Assyria performs all of his tremendous feats single-handed, as the monuments explain, and makes it a point to report that His Majesty personally dispatched the rival king. In the midst of the battle, my own hand captured Kashtilash, the Kassite king. Against the king himself at the point of the spear, under the setting of the sun, I waged battle. This last vividly recalls the Book of Mormon picture of Shiz and Coriantumr hacking away at each other until nightfall. See Ether 1520. The actual exploits of Sargon, Cyrus, Thothemes, or Thothemes III, or Ramses II, moreover, give us to understand that the personal combat between kings was no mere hollow boast, but actually took place. Since every war was a personal combat between two kings, it was customary for them to challenge each other to single combat. The king of Scythians sent his challenge to the king of the Masagate, and also to the great Darius, whose father exchanged challenges with an earlier queen of the Masagate. The king of the Visigoths challenged the emperor Honorius to single combat, as King Lazarus of Servia did Amurath the Turk, and so on. And he lists a bunch of books that he's quoting about these duels. I need not point out at this date that the whole system of chivalric etiquette originates on the steppes of Asia. The great Khans, when their rivals were captured in battle, would personally behead them, as Chinese generals still do other Chinese generals. Queen Tonris not only beheaded Cyrus, according to the legend, but mad with hatred, sloshed his head around in a... Wait, what? Queen Tomiris not only beheaded Cyrus according to the legend, but mad with hatred, sloshed his head around in a skin filled with blood. Dude, a little personal there, huh? It's not personal, it's business. No, it's not business, it's personal in this case. Wow. It was common among the rulers of the steppes to convert the skull of a personal enemy into a drinking cup, as the emperor of the burglars did with the skull of the emperor Nicephorus, and the king of Huangnu did the top piece of the ruler of Iran. The ancient Ukrainians would take their oaths by drinking blood from such vessels. Yeah, this is like Gadiant and Robber antediluvian type stuff. Whoa! The Assyrian rulers collect the skins of rival monarchs, as the Jalama did in our own day. We have dwelt at unsavory length on these gory details, because it is necessary to explain what the Book of Ether is about. The grim ferocity with which the rulers of Asia concentrate all their wrath against the person of a rival king belongs to the Jaredite tradition. And it came to pass that Coriantumr was exceeding angry with Shered, and that he went against him to battle, and they did meet in great anger. And when Shiz had received his epistle, he wrote an epistle unto Coriantumr, that if he would give himself up, that he might slay him with his own sword, that he would spare the lives of his people. That's Ether 15:5. And during the battle that ensued, Shiz arose and also his men, and he swore in his wrath that he would slay Coriantumr, or he would perish by the sword. 15:28. What these men seek before everything else is not power or victory, but a settlement with a personal rival. Next is the Wars of Extermination. Wow! Holy crap! yeah, this is a way, way, way foreign idea to me, right? Because I'm used to the idea of mechanized factory warfare, where you send all your young men of your nation to be in a meat grinder, uselessly destroying both resources, finances, lives, and material to wear out the other person, to have them bend the knee to you, or your policies as a country, instead of, like, imagine, like, Putin and, what is it, Putin and, what's his face of Ukraine? Starts with a Z, whatever. Just imagine those two literally going out on the battlefield to fight it out together. Yeah, you don't see that happening. So my question is if that's the way war was done from the cradle of civilization, when did it change and how did it change? Right? Because he's got a lot of examples ranging over a lot of Asiatic, the whole, it seems like he had stuff that sounded like Asian and Greekish type names in there. Maybe I'm wrong. But all of them just coming and fighting and battling like this. So when did it change to the idea of, we'll keep because even in England, think of it this way, even in England in the knights of old, the idea was, I would assume the local ruler and the local king, they were nobles because they were the knights. They were the ones who were going out and fighting. You served them because they had to keep up their army or their way of being able to defend. That's interesting. So did it later change because the two-tiered army system in some ways grew out of that, because the officers, even in modern military, officers are those who have gone to college, right? Whereas the enlisted are those who haven't gone to college. At least that's in the American system. And in a way, that came out of the British system, where the royalty, the knights, etc., those were the officers in the army, whereas the enlisted were just the other regular blokes. So I'm wondering if there was a change-up because of the plague or other things that made it so, this is all very interesting. That's, again, another historical aspect I don't have all the answers on. But the change from rulers being the ones who personally went after their rivals in battle to just sending armies to crush and destroy, where you get to sit back and try and keep things together. That is solidified in the political environment, especially since World War I and II, which was all mechanized factory industrial revolution war. Well, let's see here. Let's keep going back. Civil War was armies and generals going after each other. You didn't have Lincoln versus, who was the Confederate president? You didn't have them literally going out to fisticuffs on the battlefield. It was armies then. Revolutionary War, it was the same. Well, that was an interesting one. We didn't have a president at that time. George Washington would become the president, but he was the leading general, which, hey, great tradition there. No, George Washington was truly divinely appointed to be in the right place at the right time for everything. Holy cow. But that was still something where armies were sent out by the king or queen. So we're going back to European wars, where the kings and queens send their armies. And you have notable figures gaining notoriety by great acts of valor in European wars. So you've got, Napoleon was after that. That's a good kind of question. How did warfare change to go from the kings and entire nations fighting each other over a specific rivalry, and the kings fighting each other out. So they had their own skin in the game too. They get to stay aloof and send their armies. Who changed it? How did it come to that? It's fascinating. I will leave our musings on that. I am fascinated by Hugh Nibley's view of the regions the Book of Mormon would be in. There you go. We'll leave it just as it is. I'm sorry, I just have so many thoughts running through my head that I just don't want to stop. But my thoughts do not translate well to English unless I speak. But otherwise, I think it's important to, not only is it, again, reconfirming the cultural history that, again, we read it, we take it for advantage of, oh, okay, this is just what is said. But when you actually compare it to reality, when you compare it to these cultures, you're like, yeah, what did you think? That's literally how it worked. So I'm grateful I live in the time that I do. There's a lot that's wonderful about the time that I live in. A whole lot better than a lot of these other times. At the same time, there is a lot of vice and problems nowadays that have been common throughout all of time. And hopefully we're smart enough as an entire group of people to pull our heads out of the sand and start doing what's right as groups. And hopefully that way we continue on with the goodness of the world. Well, I hope you've had a good day, and may God be with you.